I'd like to invite you all to take your seats if you haven't already. And I want to particularly notice the gentleman taking his seat now, our former chancellor and beloved teacher, Ismar Schorsch. We're always delighted to have you here. Thank you, Chancellor Schorsch. Welcome to the Jewish Theological Seminary and tonight's panel, which is jointly sponsored by the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue here at JTS and the Center for, Andy's going to tell you what it's called. We have long titles. But the principal here is Andy Moraes. I'm going to invite her up in a moment to welcome you all. And a few months ago, sitting at Lincoln Center, Andy said to me, I would like to do a panel discussion on this marvelous book, The Pharisees. I had already read the book, and it is quite marvelous, and I hope you'll all take advantage of the fact that we're selling it at discount. So you can buy it for $35 outside, and I hope you'll have the same marvelous experience I did, because it's a wonderful grouping of experts. And indeed, we have a panel of experts tonight. You'll be hearing from them very shortly. But first, a word from our sponsor. We're going to start with Andy Moraes and then Josh Kramer from the American Jewish Committee. Andy, please. Stand behind me.
Yes, okay. Okay, good. It's good that I can hear myself. Usually I'm not very good with mics. So good evening, and thank you for joining us. As Bert was saying, it was really a moment that we have this idea of bringing this together, and I'm very grateful to the Milstein Center Interreligious Dialogue here at JTS, our friends who are co-hosting this event, and all the hard work also behind the scenes, so thank you very much, really. And I want to just mention that today we are here in person. It is our first event hybrid, so it's a big thing. We are learning how to do it. But also to welcome everybody that's following us online. And we have a large number of our audiences online, so welcome. We really hope that this is a space that we all build together, also with you from home or from wherever you are. And this evening, we will address a stimulating book, as Bert was mentioning. I totally advise you to get a copy after the event. And for us Christians, and I am Catholic, and so a conversation about the Pharisees, I think, is necessary. Also because negative reading of the Pharisees in our scriptures had led to stereotyping. And which sometimes, and probably many times, led and still leads to anti-Semitism. And I want to be forthcoming and say that explicitly right away, because that's what I think is so important, to have this conversation and create spaces where we can really talk more about these issues that we might think that are not even, we might take it for granted. Maybe we don't even have to talk about it, but quite the contrary, maybe we should be really talking about it. And so, as I said to Bert, don't worry, I will introduce myself. I direct the Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers work at Fordham Law School. And it's really part of our mission to create these spaces for constructive dialogue, which it is really what we are expecting for this conversation tonight. And we are hoping, obviously, that is a moment for each of us to be enriched by the conversation with each other. Without further ado, I want to introduce our colleague from the American Jewish Committee. This event will not be happening without the support of the American Jewish Committee, so thank you very much. And Joshua Kramer is the director of the New York office, so please, Josh, come and say some words to us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, as Andy said, and Rabbi Pisatsky. I'm Josh Kramer. I'm the director of American Jewish Committee's New York region. AJC is a 116-year-old advocacy organization that advocates on behalf of the priorities of the Jewish community on the in the New York region on the local, state, federal, international governments, especially with engaging with the UN here in New York. There's also a lot of AJC's work that builds coalitions across racial and ethnic and also religious lines and interreligious and interfaith efforts. And that is why we are involved here tonight. We had hoped that AJC Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations, Rabbi Noah Marins, would be able to offer greetings on behalf of AJC, who is far more intimately familiar than I am with this content and with every one of you. But earlier this week, he, after a key colleague contracted COVID, was asked at the last minute to lead an AJC mission to Germany, a country where he has done significant interreligious work on behalf of AJC. I asked Noam to share what he might have said had he been here, and here are his words. I will spare everyone my impeccable impression of Rabbi Marins. How honored we are and how appropriate it is that AJC New York is co-sponsoring this program with Fordham and JTS. It was reported in the introduction to the Pharisees volume that it was AJC's International Director of Interreligious Affairs, Rabbi David Rosen, who originally suggested the idea for an academic conference on the Pharisees, a conference which AJC also co-sponsored. That conference led to the publication of the monumental volume of essays on the Pharisees, consisting primarily of papers from the conference. The conference and book lay out what we know about the Pharisees, and in candid fashion, what we do not yet know, including all that has changed in our understanding over recent decades, even centuries. I was surprised, this is Rabbi Marin speaking, I was surprised, but shouldn't have been surprised, how much has changed in our understanding of the Pharisees since my days in rabbinical school here at JTS in the 1980s. That's how scholarship works. It evolves. The book also discusses how the term Pharisees was and is used as a derisive tool in negative portrayals of Jews through anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, a threat that is still very much with us. The volume offers practical suggestions for the prevention of demonization, utilizing the Pharisee term and other problematic tropes. I am moved that all who are organizing, moderating, and presenting this evening have either a strong connection to AJC or have had an indelible impact upon me and by extension our work at AJC, particularly in interreligious relations. 2 have been my teachers since rabbinical school here at JTS. Several have been my mentors in the study of ancient texts and their relevance to Christian-Jewish relations. 2 are alumni of AJC programs in Israel, the Christian Leadership Initiative and Project Interchange. A couple have been my role models in interfaith dialogue. To them all, we owe a debt of gratitude. I only wish I could be here with you. Thank you, Noam, and thank you to each and every one of you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and now invite you to enjoy this evening of learning. And with that, Rabbi Vysotsky.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Josh. And we're grateful to the Fordham Law School and the American Jewish Committee for doing this. I do want to say, Josh mentioned that Noam was called away because one of his colleagues came down with COVID, and we would really like to assure that no one at this event comes down with COVID. So if you're not already wearing a mask, we invite you to wear one, and there are spare masks out in the foyer, so please do that. I am going to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Each will have an opening statement of about 10 minutes, and then I will invite them afterwards to slug it out with one another. And then at the very end, we will have about 10-15 minutes for audience questions, which I will moderate. I'm Bert Vysotsky. I am a professor emeritus, and let me emphasize that, emeritus, here at JTS. And I am delighted. When I was a rabbinical student, I used to say that so often in my classes that my students used to do shots every time I would say that, and classes were really quite entertaining as a result. When I was a rabbinical student, it was clear to me that to learn Talmud and Midrash properly, which is my area of study, I really needed to learn not only Hebrew and Aramaic, but Greek. Koine Greek in particular, New Testament Greek, the Greek of the Church Fathers. And the easiest way to do that was for me to simply cross the street to Union Theological Seminary, a liberal Protestant seminary, where I studied Greek with the professor of New Testament, Marcia Weinstein. As you might hear from her name, she was not a Protestant, nor was she a Catholic. She was a nice Jewish girl who really knew Greek inside out, backwards, and upside down. But together, Marcia and I had to suffer because the books that we read and taught us how to do Greek would repeatedly invoke hoi Pharisaioi, hoi kakoi, oh, the evil Pharisees. Again and again and again, we confronted the New Testament tropes of Pharisees. And it remains, all these years later, 50 years later, a conundrum. So I'm especially grateful that we have this expert panel and this wonderful book to begin to unpack once again the Pharisees. Again, when I was a rabbinical student, if you said the book, The Pharisees, everybody assumed you meant the 3-volume work on the Pharisees written by our teacher Louis Finkelstein. There have been other Pharisees books since then, but I'm truly grateful for this book. Immediately to my left is my friend Joseph Sievers. Back 45, 50 years ago, Joseph was here in the neighborhood doing his doctorate at Columbia. He has taught Jewish history and the literature of the Hellenistic period at the Pontifical Biblical Institute since 1991. A Catholic priest, he's a member of the Focolare movement since 1965. And Joseph, I think you joined on the day that Nostra Aetate was approved, which is pretty impressive. He served as the director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University. In that period, I was happy enough to teach at the Gregorian, and I'm glad to be able to return the welcome that I received from you. And together with A.J. Levine, he edited The Pharisees. 2 down is Angela Kim Harkins. She is an associate professor at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She was a Marie Curie International Incoming Fellow at the University of Birmingham. That's England, not Alabama. And a Fulbright Scholar at the Hebrew University. Dr. Harkins has published extensively on the topics of prayers, emotions, and religious experience in both Jewish and Christian texts. At the very end of the table is really my old friend, Shaya J.D. Cohn. Shaya is currently the Littauer Professor of Hebrew Literature and Philosophy in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations of Harvard University. Before arriving at Harvard, Shaya was for 10 years the Samuel Ungerleider Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University. But most important, he began his career at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So Shaya, welcome home. And last but hardly least is Amy Jill Levine. AJ is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, and University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. And with Joseph Sievers, she is the editor of The Pharisees. So Joseph is going to begin his 10 minutes on the project itself.
Thank you very much, Bert. For me, it's really a very special moment to be back here. Well, I did not expect to meet the former chancellor here, whom I met many, many years ago. The first time I entered this building for an interview, I applied to JTS, and then we agreed that it might be better for me to start at Columbia. But I always remember that first meeting here with the Chancellor and with Professor Avraham Holz. Anyway, now I've been here also for courses, for seminars. I remember one seminar with Professor Bickerman, and other courses that I had here. Today, the Pharisees, and the question is, whose law? Well, the only person who introduces himself as a Pharisee is Paul, and he gives us half a sentence, and that is katanomon Pharisaios. According to the law, a Pharisee. He doesn't elaborate on that, and there's no verb. It's not said that he was a Pharisee or that he is a Pharisee. Anyway, I cannot go into the details of this, but the question, who really were the Pharisees? What can Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, and secular scholars contribute to our knowledge of the Pharisees? That became a project that brought together 27 scholars actually from different countries, some Jewish, some Catholic, some Protestant, some non-affiliated, and we discussed this first in a conference in 2019 in Rome, and then this became this volume. So the first question was, how come the Pharisees did get such a bad press in much Christian teaching and literature and preaching, although in Jewish tradition, and you mentioned Professor Finkelstein, there's the image is very different. So how do we approach that? And the idea was we have to start from a study of the sources with the best specialists on each of these sources. And so we got probably the best known scholar on Josephus, living scholar on Josephus, Steve Mason, and from him we learned how little importance the Pharisees had in the writings of Josephus. Then we had a scholar from Tel Aviv University speak about Pharisees in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Although they are not mentioned by name, it becomes fairly clear that opponents mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls could be identified as Pharisees. Then we had different scholars on the different parts of the New Testament, from Paul to the Gospels and Acts and so on. And then we had several scholars dealing with the Pharisees in rabbinic literature. One of these, not at the conference, but in the book, is Shaya Cohen, from whom you will hear. So I don't want to go into these details, but studying all the sources was the first step, and maybe coming also to divergent results, and very often we don't know. We don't know as much as we would like to know. But if we recognize that we don't know, how can we say all Pharisees were bad, or all Pharisees were like this or like that? So sometimes ignorance, acknowledging our lack of knowledge can help us to overcome prejudices. And then we did not stop there. We went into the history of reception. The other day someone said reception history. If I hear that, that reminds me of wine and cheese. But no, that was not wine and cheese, but it was the church fathers. It was later rabbinic literature. It was the arts, even movies, textbooks for schools, and studying how they are taught in sermons and so on. And the last step was, what can we do about it now? What will be the next steps, the future of the Pharisees? So this, therefore, was a project with many different voices and divergent voices at times, but the project was unified. We want to see how we can better inform and people about how little we know and what we know and what we, how we should treat them maybe better. I suggested at the end, what would be if we would apply the golden rule, what you don't want others to do to you, don't do it to them, found in Hillel and Jesus. How would that be if we apply it to when we talk about Pharisees? Would we want to be talked about as they are preached about at times? Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for the important reminder about what we don't know. And of course, that is a conundrum for everyone in a classroom who's teaching students, because none of us as professors wants to get up and teach our students what we don't know. So I'm delighted to put Angela on the spot and say, how do you approach this in your teaching?
Okay. Thank you so much for this kind invitation to be with you this evening. It's really a great honor for me to be among such distinguished speakers. I teach at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, formerly known as Weston School of Theology. I am an ordinary professor at Pontifical School, and at the STM we give ecclesiastical degrees in sacred theology signed by the Pope. As such, which it's pretty cool, I think you have to admit. As such, we have a significant international population of religious, lay, and ordained students from all over the world. In the classroom, I have a pastoral responsibility to our students, many of whom will go on to serve the church and the wider public in meaningful capacities, either in the church or in the classroom. My courses have the long-term goal of preparing my students for ministry in a diverse world, including meaningful encounters with non-Christian religions and their adherents. My own time at the STM began in 2015 when I was hired to replace Dan Harrington, a prolific Jesuit biblical scholar who passed away the previous year in 2014. Dan was someone who just knew everything and did everything, and he's sorely missed, I really have to say. He taught Gospels, and he also worked very much in Second Temple Judaism. I would describe myself as someone who works primarily in Second Temple Judaism and who teaches Gospels from that Second Temple perspective. In preparation for this evening, I've been thinking very much about the important pastoral question of why students preparing for ordination should be aware of the largely historical questions that are covered in this volume. Christian anti-Judaism is a long-standing negative perception of the Jews of the past, but it also continues to influence how Jews are perceived today. It is a pressing topic, since those who survived the Holocaust are quickly passing away, leaving us without flesh and blood witnesses to these events. How can I impress upon these future Christian leaders, and through them, their future congregations, the important responsibility that all Christians have to remember Christian anti-Judaism and to seek to transform that legacy into something life-giving. Especially relevant to my context at the STM is the essay by Philip Cunningham, which shows well the enormous challenge of teaching the topic of Jews, past and present, in a Catholic context. Cunningham describes well how Christian anti-Judaism appears in Catholic religion books and persists in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. One observation that I would like to share specific to my own institutional context within an ecclesiastical faculty. I was the first woman ever to teach in the biblical studies area when I was hired in 2015, and at the time of my hire, the Bible requirement for MDiv students, both ordination candidates and lay students, was 5 courses in sacred scripture. Not long before that, the requirement was 6 courses. However, today it is 4 courses. According to the recently published Program for Priestly Formation, this is the 6th edition, just came out this summer in 2000 of this year, students preparing for ordination should take a variety of core courses in biblical studies. And they actually list 8, okay? And we have 4 required courses. Pentateuch, prophets, wisdom and Psalms, historical books, okay, for Old Testament, Synoptic Gospels and Acts, Pauline literature, John, and Catholic epistles. Most of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament courses offered at the STM focus on the religion of ancient Israel and not on the diverse religious groups of the Second Temple period. It is good that the new edition of the Program for Priestly Formation urges seminaries to teach about the organic relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, thereby avoiding the tendency to isolate Jesus from his Jewish context. Because the scripture courses are organized according to canonical groupings, there's no category per se for teaching about the diversity of Judaisms during the Second Temple period. As an ordinary professor, my primary opportunity to teach MDiv students who the Pharisees were arises most immediately in the context of the Gospels. It can, however, be difficult to teach about the Pharisees as, quote, leaders in a period of revolutionary, social, and religious creativity after the demise of the temple, end quote. This is Cunningham's words. When the texts in which we encounter them generally portray them stereotypically, and always in negative contrast to Jesus and the church. We know that the Second Temple period is crucial for understanding the historical, social, and political context of ancient Jewish and early Christian groups, but the standard curriculum for seminaries is not updated to reflect all that we now know about this time period. I often wonder, what if seminarians were required to take a course on Second Temple Judaism, one that presented various Jewish groups like the Pharisees in a curricular context that is independent of the Gospels? The Pharisees would be encountered as a form of Judaism within the larger, diverse panorama that existed during the Second Temple period, and not solely through the portrait found in the Gospels. While I offer a course at the STM on Second Temple Judaisms, it is not a required course and is not conceptualized among the course offerings identified by the Program for Priestly Formation. Second Temple Judaisms is an elective for interested students and for specialized graduate students. If there are no curricular requirements, the teaching about Christian anti-Judaism becomes dependent solely on the instructors who teach these courses. The longer I teach at the STM, the more I become aware that teaching is a ministry where I'm called to meet students where they are. While they may arrive without much coursework in Scripture, they have a strong desire to know more about the Scriptures and about Christ. As an ordinary professor, I'm keenly aware my time is limited, and students may not have full understanding of the many core teachings of Catholicism itself, teachings like the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or about Christ's divinity. These excellent studies on the Pharisees ask readers to nuance and reconfigure their understanding of the people of the past. They're intellectual discussions of important topics that show the multiple ways scholars make meaning from the sources that have survived. Many of my ministry students, however, are not quite intellectuals. They're at the STM because they are people of faith who are passionate about serving the church. And so the first group of essays concerns itself with the historical question, who are the Pharisees, and how can we reconstruct who they were from the sources and material culture that remains? This historical inquiry is not unlike the tried and true questions that guided me well in my own graduate training at the University of Notre Dame. These wonderful questions about the flesh and blood people behind the texts, those who wrote, edited, redacted them in antiquity, helped me to think deeply about the time and the distance traveled by the scriptures from the ancient past to the present day. These same historical questions, however, seldom resonate in the same way in the minds of the students whom I have taught at the STM. In other words, ministry students seldom get fired up about the same things that interest me deeply. As the years go by, ministry students have less and less knowledge of ancient texts and their contexts. It is also the case that other events and issues like 9/11, the sex abuse crisis, climate change, and Black Lives Matter have more impact on the imaginations of my students and their pastoral concerns than the Holocaust and Nostra Aetate, simply because these are events that have happened in their own lifetimes. Here in my final comments, I want to turn to Craig Morrison's fine essay, which begins the volume. He asks the question, what exactly do we mean when we speak about the ancient group, the Pharisees? As biblical scholars, we rely on texts and word studies largely because this is what we have to work with, yet perhaps we do this to a fault. As Craig shows, our usual routes for understanding these people of the past are inadequate and do not yield any greater understanding of the Pharisees. Instead, Craig uses the well-known story of Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's tragic romance, to get at the heart of how a single misunderstood name, like the Montagues in the town of Verona, or we would say the Pharisees in the Gospels, might unnecessarily stand in the way of what would otherwise be a truly heartfelt and long-lived relationship. The Montagues and the Capulet families, of course, standing in for the Jews and Christians. I like Craig's essay very much because ministry and ordination students are not heady intellectuals who cogitate over linguistic conundrums. Some are, but the majority are not. Instead, ministry students, lay and ordinandi, are all people who you might say think first with their hearts. I think they would understand Craig's point well, that one misunderstood name can lead to a heart-wrenching tragedy that can impact flesh and blood communities for lifetimes. It is important for our Christian students preparing for ordination, for ministry in the church, to read and to be challenged by the work in this volume. For me, Craig's cultural reference to Romeo and Juliet works so well because I know the story so well. Although let's remember that this is a story that ended badly. Readers like me were gutted when the two star-crossed lovers end up dying tragically from broken hearts. Why did they have to die? Why couldn't it end some other way? Romeo and Juliet is a classic text and required reading for high school students, and so the power of this story emerges from a culturally Western model of education. And I'm mindful of the fact that our international students come from countries that have different stories, and Romeo and Juliet may simply not have the same gut-wrenching impact. The point I would like to close with is the reminder, and I'm speaking first and foremost to myself, that the task of educating future leaders of the church is a global one that extends beyond North America and Europe. The question, why should ministry students today care about how Jews in antiquity are understood, should be couched in a global context and framed by more than a historical desire to understand. It should be formulated as a topic that speaks to the very heart of those who do ministry in a global church. And so I want to close with the comments by Massimo Grilli and Joseph Sievers, who speak so very well to the global context of the STM. When speaking, especially when teaching or preaching about the Pharisees, try to avoid stereotypes as you would like others to avoid stereotypes about your own religious affiliation and national or ethnic background or your personal characteristics. This is a teaching that I think all ministry students who think first with their heart would understood well because it is oriented toward the love of God and neighbor and allows for the possibility of encountering the other in a loving relationship that doesn't end tragically like the love of Romeo and Juliet, but which flourishes and lives on from one generation to the next.
Thank you very much. And I do, Angela, want to witness this audience. We haven't had to carry anyone out stage left or stage right at the end of your talk. Shia J.D. Cohen, you're up.
With your collective permission, I will take off my mask while I speak, just because it makes life easier. When I was invited to attend a session this evening, I thought about my own essay in the volume, which I think is a fairly good essay. But I realized that there was something really important that I had not addressed in my essay, and I thought perhaps I should spend a few pages and a few minutes talking about this. What I'm referring to is Matthew 23. So I believe Matthew chapter 23 hovers over the entire volume. There is at least one chapter devoted just to it, but it recurs regularly, and I would say the problem text that gives us all willies, or other right term is Matthew chapter 23. Matthew 23 is a series of very strong denunciations of the Pharisees by Jesus, right, who accuses them of all sorts of things. And the one word that sticks out more than any other in Matthew 23 is hypocrites. That the Pharisees are hypocrites. They preach, but they do not do. They do things just for show. They're not sincere. They're not for real. They are interested only in what is good for them or what they enjoy doing. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I could take out my phone and start to read the chapter to you, but you could take out your phone and start to read the chapter if you like. The author of that chapter, I refer to the author that way because I'm not sure this is really Jesus talking. The author of that chapter acknowledges the fact, I'm sorry, thank you. I'll try it this way. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The author of that chapter acknowledges that the Pharisees have social clout. They sit in the front, they sit on the seat of Moses, they preach, they clearly have some social standing in the eyes of the author. Except that the author of Matthew 23 argues that the Pharisees abuse their social standing. They abuse their power precisely because they don't behave properly either with themselves or, more importantly, with others. They tell the others what to do, but they don't do it themselves. I will save time and not read Matthew 23, but anyway, there you are. And that chapter really bothers me. It has bothered me for a very long time, and I think we need to collectively to discuss what can we do with it. All of us know that in our scriptures, both we Jews and we Christians, have various what I like to call hard passages. There are hard passages. These are passages that we wish weren't there. If you want a list, I'm happy to give you a list, right? Or at least my working list, right? If I had been there when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, right, I would have seen to it that these passages would have been at least written differently or perhaps just omitted because they are hard. The passage as that stands is a challenge to us, people of good faith, who really wish that these passages were better. So what do we do with Matthew 23? The short answer is, I don't have very long to speak anyway, but the short answer is I don't know, because it's there. The other thing, the way most modern scholars deal with Matthew 23 is to argue that the chapter represents a site of competition between the early Christians and these Jewish authorities. And as a result of this social, political, cultural competition, we have this very nasty statement. But nobody's going to say that the statement is accurate or historical any more than you would trust the political ads of a candidate. Right. We understand why they say what they say, because they want your vote, or they want you not to vote for the other guy. Right. We understand why they say what they say, but we're not going to take it too seriously as fact, when it's pretty obvious that these are not facts at all, but these are partisan statements by one group against opponents. Now, how we understand where these Matthew 23 people are, what is the nature of the Matthean social community, and how the audience of the text and the text itself fit together, and how we are to reconstruct the world of Matthew 23, that's Okay, that's a problem, right? That is discussed endlessly by historians, by commentators on the New Testament, to try to understand what exactly is the setting, such that we can imagine why Matthew 23 says what it says. Because I'm going to say flat out, I believe it is false. Right? I believe Matthew 23, right, is as truthful as a political ad. Now, I still need to understand why it says what it says. That is a perfectly reasonable historical question. I need to understand context. I need to understand function. Okay, that for me is still an open question, and as I said, if you look at the commentaries of Matthew 23, there's no shortage of commentaries and attempts. But I'm willing to understand the text. But I'm willing to say, I, Shai Cohen, am willing to say, I do not accept this as a factual evidence for what the real Pharisees were like. That some Pharisees may have been hypocritical, of course. That not all Pharisees were very nice, of course. That not all Pharisees did what they preached and preached what they did, of course. That's true everywhere. Right? Show me a religious, cultural, political institution where we don't have examples of this. So that I'm willing to say up front and out loud. The problem is then I need to get back to the issues of context, as I was saying, right? And that is the large historical question. Then, I'm moving right along here. But then it occurred to me that I've got a problem. I, Shia Cohen, Jew. I've got a problem because it's not just in Matthew 23 that the Pharisees are characterized as hypocrites, but it's also in the Babylonian Talmud. Right, in Tractate Sota, page 22. And here again, I was prepared to read the text, but in the interest of time, I will not read the text, even though I schlepped this computer all the way from Boston. Right. What you have in the Babylonian Talmud, footnote, with parallels in the Yerushalmi and of Rabbi Natan and other such places, but that's not my problem at the moment. Back to where I am. Right. What you have in the Babylonian Talmud is a condemnation, is a list, a catalog of wicked Pharisees. Footnote, Pharisees. Well, we got a problem with the word. This recurs also in the volume several times. The word Prushi or Prushim in Rabbinic Hebrew, is that to be translated Pharisee? That to be translated separatist? That should be translated pietist? That should be translated, how exactly should it be translated? Answer, we don't know, and that comes back up in the volume, I would say, half dozen times we have this, different scholars try to deal with the issue of, are these Pharisees? Short answer, I believe on this passage the answer is yes, they are Pharisees. I believe it in this passage because right after this list, this catalog of 7 Prushim, right, the Talmud has a brief anecdote where it is unambiguous that the anecdote is referring to Pharisees, because I know that from a parallel in Josephus. So the page is talking about Pharisees. And here the Talmud itself condemns 7 types of Pharisees, right, precisely for religious insincerity, showing off how pious they are, right, trying to get others to admire them. Look how pious I am. I can't wait to do more commandments. Precisely the sort of thing that's condemned in Matthew 23.
Shia, this is your 1-minute warning.
Thank you. Now I'm thrown what I don't know what to do. Okay. Now I wanted to say the following. I don't believe that catalog of 7 wicked Pharisees that you have in the Babylonian Talmud so-called confirms the truth of Matthew 23, or that Matthew 23 confirms the truth of what's in the Babylonian Talmud. No, I don't believe that at all. I frankly admit, I don't know exactly where either of these texts comes from, because I'm looking for social setting. The main point that I would argue as a historian would be that the Matthew 23 passage clearly deals with political power, really deals with social prominence. Where it's interesting is that the passage in the Babylonian Talmud is about an individual. These are individuals with character flaws, we would say. Individuals with character faults, we would say. And the Talmud is willing to say, in our number, there are such people. It's a self-examination. Within our society, we have such people. True. It does not, however, mean, as Matthew 23 implies, that we should throw out the old Pharisaic order because they don't deserve to be leaders of society anymore and to be replaced by a new group. But, okay, my time is up.
Thank you, Professor Cohn. And now, batting cleanup, A.J. Levine.
Good evening. How lovely to be with you. What an honor to be on this panel. Thank you. In his May 9th, 2019 address to the Pontifical Biblical Institute, together with their guests gathered for an international conference on the Pharisees, His Holiness Pope Francis said both, quote, "Among Christians and in secular society, in different languages, the word Pharisee often means a self-righteous or hypocritical person. For many Jews, however, the Pharisees are the founders of Rabbinic Judaism and hence their own spiritual forebears. And, quote, one of the most ancient and damning stereotypes is that of Pharisee, especially when used to cast Jews in a negative light. The stereotype of Pharisees, which then extends to all Jews, takes several forms. Here are my top 7. Here are the tropes. Pharisees and so all Jews are legalistic, elitist, money-loving, xenophobic, misogynistic, hypocritical stand-ins for political and social policy we do not like. In speaking with Christian teachers and preachers, I've often, however, found pushback when I suggest that when they categorize Pharisees or Jews by these terms, that they are bearing false witness against Pharisees and Jews. And I've also found not only pushback, but a fair amount of resistance to alternative readings. As I've argued elsewhere, Christian defensiveness regarding the validity of these pernicious stereotypes, it must be true because Matthew says it's true, and therefore a lack of any anti-Semitism on their part, is much like the phenomenon of white privilege and white fragility. The privilege makes one oblivious to offensive comments and behaviors, and the fragility makes one defensive when the offense is pointed out. And thus, I have heard from Christian students and from people whose columns I found to bear false witness against Jews and Jews. I spend a lot of time writing to people saying, stop saying that, because somebody's got to do it. I get comments such as, here are my top 7. Well, I'm just saying what the Bible says. Some of my best friends are Jews. You're being too sensitive. The tu quoque argument, Jews say nasty things about Jesus, which the Talmud does, but that's another subject. The excuse by appealing to other Jewish and or contemporaneous rhetoric argument, for example, in the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible, the Pontifical Biblical Commission states, quote, the invective and the accusation hurled at the scribes and Pharisees, and this is speaking to what Professor Cohen mentions, this is Matthew 23, it's similar to those found in the prophets and corresponds to a contemporary literary genre which was common in Judaism, for example, Qumran, and also in Hellenism. In other words, the birds do it, the bees did it. Everybody says nasty things, so Matthew is really not a problem. Or, my number 6, other problems, and this is something Angela alluded to, racism, sexism, ableism, etc., are more important, so why are you worried about anti-Semitism, as well as the corollary defense? I can't be an anti-Semite because I'm a member of a minoritized community, and only people with hegemonic power can be bigots. I think this is silly, by the way. And the favorite excuse, well, I didn't mean all Jews. Well, none of these excuses is helpful. We are better off looking at the tendencies of the gospel writers, the alternative ways of reading some of the gospel portrayals of the Pharisees, and then changing our general image of who these people were. On looking, for example, at redactional tendencies, we do well by naming the increasing vilification. And this is just a matter of reading the Gospels. For example, Mark, I'm in Mark 12 here, depicts a scribe impressed by Jesus' teaching in the temple, who then asks him about the greatest commandment. Jesus responds by citing Deuteronomy chapter 5, the opening of the Shema on love of God, and Leviticus 19 and love of neighbor. The scribe in Mark approves the response, and Jesus responds in Mark 12:34, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Matthew 22 rephrases the opening by identifying the interlocutor not as a scribe, but as a lawyer, nomikos, sent from the Pharisees and Sadducees. And Matthew, unlike Mark, pairs Pharisees and Sadducees. That's a weird grouping. That's like Democrats and Republicans having a dance. It's just weird. With the motive of testing Jesus rather than one of appreciating his answers, and by eliminating Jesus' concluding praise. So Matthew's extensive vilification of the Pharisees, much the result of redactional changes, is clearly, by the way, antithetical to Matthew's own Sermon on the Mount. The same redactional point holds for the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, the screed in Matthew 23. As Adela Collins states in her article in the Pharisees volume on Matthew, this is quoting Adela, in my view, most of the blame falls on Matthew. But what if the teaching goes back to Jesus? Christian doctrine affirms the humanity of Jesus Christ as much as his divinity. Being human means being influenced by our culture and not always living up to a high standard. So even if we believe that the vituperation in Matthew 23 goes back to Jesus, we can still critique it, especially in light of the higher standard of the Sermon on the Mount. The teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is notoriously difficult to observe. It is, nevertheless, a call to a high standard to which Christians should aspire, and a standard that helps us better approach the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees of Matthew 23. Or, on alternative readings, because we can always search for new meanings, for Luke's parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, instead of reading Luke 18:14 as, I say to you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his home justified rather than the other, why not read the Greek parikenon as alongside the other, since perhaps the tax collector, now justified in the temple, tapped into the Pharisees' merit. This would be like zechut avot, the merits of the fathers. Otherwise, the parable teaches the followers of Jesus to repeat the Pharisees' prayer and saying, thank God I'm not like that Pharisee. And that would be dumb, because it's the Pharisee who tithes and who walks the walk, rather than just talks the talk. And we might finally revise how we understand Pharisees by reversing the stereotypes. There's a very well-known bestseller, especially among evangelical Protestants, a book by R.T. Kendall entitled, You Might Be a Pharisee If, with the subtitle, 25 Things Many Christians Do But Jesus Would Rebuke. So you might be a Pharisee if whatever you do, Jesus would not like. I'd like to reverse the approach. Another 7. You might be a Pharisee if you believe in a combination of fate and free will. It's Josephus, it's also Paul. You might be a Pharisee if you believe in resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. You might be a Pharisee if you reject elitism and favor voluntary groups over inherited positions, which is why the priests didn't like them. You might be a Pharisee if you value your own traditions, but you also realize they must be reinterpreted in light of new social circumstances. In fact, you might be a Pharisee if you want to make it easier and more meaningful for people to engage their traditions, and you're willing to discuss how to do so. You might be a Pharisee if you care about multiculturalism and maintaining group identity despite assimilationist tendencies. You might be a Pharisee if you have been maligned over the centuries for your commitment to your tradition. Or you might be a Pharisee if you'd have dinner with Jesus, and you might even join the movement of people gathered in his name. And when you do so, like Paul, you do not cease to be a Pharisee, you just think you're a better one. There's more to be done, but that will require institutional buy-in. Better homiletic guides for priests, better textbooks in educational settings, better instruction for the laity, accountability when representatives of the church, including the Catholic press, use negative stereotypes about Pharisees. Revisions of the Sunday lectionary, I know I'm pushing it here, but why not? Both regarding those passages that set up the Old Testament as a negative foil to the New, and those that talk about Pharisees without any historical context. And finally, conversations, such as the conference Joseph Sievers organized in Rome, and the one that Andy and Bert have organized this evening. Well, that's actually 6, and ideally our following conversations will surface 7 and more as to how we can do this better.
Thank you, AJ. I think you've convinced me I'm a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees of the tribe of Levi. I wanted to invite each of the speakers in turn, and you can simply say no if you don't want to. If there's anything that your colleague said that you think merits some comment or some explication, and I'm going to start with you, Joseph.
Okay, Shaya, thank you very much for this juxtaposition. I'm still wondering whether the Isha Perusha, for example, who is also, I think, in the Babylonian Talmud, if she's a Pharisaic woman or if it means something else. I'm not sure we can know that, but you are, if anyone knows, you are among those.
Yeah, this is in the Mishnah on that.
Speak into the mic, Chuck.
Okay, yeah, this is in the Mishnah. Joseph is referring to the passage, which the Mishnah itself has some very mysterious and cryptic phrases, including Isha Prusha, a perhaps ascetic woman, perhaps a separatist woman, perhaps a detail-oriented woman, perhaps, I'm not sure how to translate it, right? And the Mishnah says, such a one as this, how is it translated? Say exactly, is an unpleasant thing. It's bad for the world. I have no idea what this means. I will just stop there. I would check my recently edited, here plug for myself, right? I recently edited a new translation of the Mishnah. So one thing I would do is be to go home and see what the translator of Tractate Sota does with that passage, but I don't know what to do with it.
Thank you. Shaya, since you have the mic, is there anything you want to approach your colleagues about?
No, I spoke too long already.
Shaya, your modesty becomes you. I thank you. Angela, you've been teaching, you've been listening, you really laid out some of the issues for us. What would you say to these three? What do you need to know, or what do we need to know that you were hearing that you think bears explication?
Well, I was going to say something else. Please. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Instead of answering your question. I wanted to just say, as a biblical scholar, I found most helpful the essay by Susanna Heschel and Deborah Forger, and I really want to urge people to read that essay, because they really outline just this sort of deep-seatedness of anti-Judaism in biblical scholarship, sort of what we might call routine or normative biblical scholarship. It should be required reading, I think, for anybody who does biblical studies. I mean, I know a lot of my comments were really focused on, we don't have a space to talk about the Pharisees per se in any course. But that essay in this volume, I think, can be used in any biblical studies course. Those of you who study or who are teaching biblical studies, I mean, I really want to urge you to really consult and use that essay, because it just shows how what we consider to be what scholars maybe called objective or historical was really very tendentious, and so I think it's just a helpful one. That's really what I wanted to add in my comments, because I didn't.
Thank you. No, that's
but I love
better than answering my question.
I just want to thank you for being so clear. So that's what.
Yes,
I think that's
AJ, I'm so happy you have the last word, because you always are so lucid and give the last word. You don't have to list 7 things, but is there anything you want to ask of your colleagues or further comment you'd like to make?
I want to add 2 points, because my colleague here, Joseph, is so modest. Drives me insane. There's an Italian translation which was published almost simultaneously with the English of the Pharisees volume, and there is now contracted a German translation with new essays, particularly for people in German-speaking areas, and more concerning Protestant issues, which are covered in this book, but a little bit more heavily. And the other thing is that earlier work that Joseph Sievers did, which we haven't mentioned, how do we get at Pharisees? There are lots of named Pharisees. You would know some of them from the New Testament, like Gamaliel or Paul or Nicodemus. And sometimes if you actually have a character to latch onto as opposed to the broad category, it's another way of getting into who the Pharisees are by pointing out individuals. So it's a different pedagogical understanding, and it works very well in the classroom. So instead of talking about the Pharisees, would Nicodemus do that? Would Gamaliel do that? Would Paul do that? So how we understand the Pharisees will depend upon the Pharisees we are looking at, whether as individuals or collectives. And I want to shout out to Joseph, who first brought that up to scholarship.
Thank you. I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative and actually not ask any further question, because I want to just take, we're already over time, but take a few minutes if there's anyone in the audience who indeed has a burning question and wants to address it to one of our panelists. I would welcome that. Like in the game of Jeopardy, it should be in the form of a question, not a sermonette, not a speech, not invective, but I'm looking for hands if there is someone. All right, so it's great. We have one at the right and one at the left. So let's start. Please.
Thank you. My question is brief. Do you see any educational lessons we learn if we juxtapose the Pharisees and their often negative portrayal with that of the Greek sophist?
Anyone want to jump in there? Pharisees and sophists? Shia.
If you read modern commentaries on Matthew 23, you will see that there is a great deal of attention to the rhetoric, namely that ancients have a rhetoric of abuse in which one opponent opposes the other and will, generally speaking, say very nasty things about his opponent. And everybody knows in the audience, well, they're just talking that way because that's what's expected of them, but it's not, quote, real, quote unquote, or it's not, necessarily factual. So that's I don't know if that's sophist, but this is Greek rhetoric. And you can see the same thing, by the way, in John Chrysostom's Attacks on the Jews in his volume, which has terrible things to say about Jews. But there again, one scholarly approach is to say, well, people in the 4th century in Antioch expected a rhetorician to say nasty things about his opponent because that's what's expected. Again, it might be analogous to a political campaign today where you expect candidate 1 to besmirch, to say nasty things about candidate number 2, but you take it all with a grain of salt.
All right, Christina, you want to bring the mic over? There was somebody on the left-hand side there. Yes, he's standing up already. Thank you. So, ask away.
Thank you. Hi there, thanks. I'm a third-year student at Union across the street where I only have to take 3 Bible classes. So I'm really grateful to be here to continue to get some more education. And my question is, I really do want to give a sermon, but I won't. But so my question is, do you personally think, and do you know if there's any scholarship that points to whether or not Jesus was a Pharisee?
I'll get this one. Yeah, no. And a lot of the earlier Jesus was a Pharisee, and there are books that have made this suggestion, substantially come out of Jewish apologetic. You can see this in Heschel and Forger's article that Angela alluded to, going back to Abraham Geiger. Jesus and the Pharisees share a fair amount in common, and it might be what Freud would call the narcissism of minor differences. The closer you are, the higher the rhetoric is, because you have to stake your claim. But there's no evidence that he was a Pharisee. He is not part of a group. He operates in terms of charismatic leadership rather than what the Pharisees call the traditions of the elders. The Pharisees, as many people have argued in this volume, were actually the liberalizers. Jesus typically takes a more conservative stance, and he often sides with what would be considered Sadduceic rather than Pharisaic concerns. So, no.
Thank you from coming all the way across the street from Union to get a firm no from A.J. Levine. Is there one more question, maybe?
Can I say something?
You sure can.
This goes back to the question of the sophists, which is a really good question. The difference is that we're not just dealing with Jesus' invective in terms of rhetoric. We're dealing with a genre of gospel, whatever this is, whether it's a biography or a great man's story, where the Pharisees as characters, not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of narrative description, are already plotting to destroy him, back in chapter 2. And then, although the Pharisees do drop out of the passion narrative for the most part, they pop back in the resurrection scene to deny. In Matthew, for example, it's the Pharisees who say, say the disciples stole the body. So it's not just the invective, it's not just the rhetoric, it's the entire plot line, which goes beyond questions of sophist rhetoric.
I want to invite you all to join me in thanking this panel. This was truly a Vorspeise, a taste of the riches that are in this book. I'm going to say it again. It's available at discount, a 30% discount, just out that door. And if you thought that tonight was thought-provoking, if it intrigued you, the book is just so incredibly rich. Page after page after page, you will rethink what you thought you knew. And that is a wonderful bar for great scholarship. So I thank especially AJ and Joseph for editing the work and for our panel. Thank you. For those who need to know, the Unterberg Auditorium is in the basement of this building. The elevators go all the way down.
Do you?